Our vision is the energy trilemma. So it's really solving for security, affordability, and sustainability.
The only way to get scale is to build something that delivers massive amounts of product. It's so easy to make money making oil. Like, you drill your resource, it comes out of the ground, you know it's going to cost.
Welcome back to Clean Techies, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs and investors. I'm Silas Maynor, and today I will be your host. Today, we've got a much more freewheeling conversation than normal. We've got two incredible guests, Ahmed and Jason Ethier, two of the founding partners at Energy Tech Nexus. If you are not familiar with them, they are building an incredible community in Houston for founders working at the intersection of energy, tech, and innovation broadly. And they've got an incredible coalition of corporates and investors that surround them to support these founders building in this space. Jason was heavily involved in Greentown Labs, including their expansion into Houston. And Nada has an incredible background working on a lot of projects around the world. And in particular, she did some good work on carbon capture space, which you will hear about today. Today, our conversation really just covers 5 core themes. Number 1, their thoughts on what the Trump administration means for clean tech. Number 2, how nuclear could possibly get a jumpstart during this administration to get it moving, get the rails built, and get some momentum there. Number 3, will carbon capture just survive, or will it actually thrive during the coming years? Number 4, what will the role of oil and gas majors be in clean tech over the coming years? And number 5, what is unique about the Houston ecosystem? As an FYI, none of this conversation is behind the paywall, so you can enjoy the entire discussion. And one heads up we want to offer you is, if you are in Houston or going to be in Houston for the Hydrogen Forum on February 12th and 13th, come meet us there. With Energy Tech Nexus, we are actually going to be doing a happy hour and live podcast. And now I've said it, it's out in the public. We have to make it happen. We still have a lot of details to iron out. The event itself should be happening on the 12th, sometime in the afternoon and evening, the live recording, and then followed by the happy hour, like I said. It's going to be probably largely focused on hydrogen, given the Hydrogen Forum in town. But, obviously there's going to be a lot of great clean tech people there in general. So we will see you in Houston, and I'm looking forward to this very much. Both Somil and I should be there. So, all right, let's get into the show. All right, boom. We're live. How you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
I am fine as frog hair, as I like to say, or as my dad likes to say, and I've parroted that. Have you guys heard that one before?
No. Where does that reference come from?
I have no idea. Probably just that frog hair is so fine, you never knew that frogs had hair. You can't see it. I really don't know the origin of it, but dads like to have lots of dad lines, right? So
yeah, it's like one of those dad jokes. Yeah,
exactly. I'm working on that now. I just had my first recently, so I have to practice my dad jokes, get them all.
Yeah, congratulations.
Ready to go. Yeah, thank you guys. Well, I guess, guys, give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself. I think, probably a lot of people listening know who you are, but just give us both a little intro to each of you and what you guys are working on.
I'm Jason Ethier, one of the founding partners here at Energy Tech Nexus. I've been a lifelong entrepreneur working in energy. Started out at Duke University working on cars, of all things, and realized I wanted to be in the thick of it. So moved to Boston, met a bunch of awesome entrepreneurs, helped start Greentown Labs with about 5 others. And it was like a roller coaster journey of just kind of experiencing the heyday of climate. And it was very interesting because there was no money, zero money in climate. And I remember sitting with an investor and him saying, Jason, love what you're doing. Don't call yourself climate tech. No one wants to invest in it. And here we are, 12 years later. And guess what? There's a ton of capital coming into the space. There's actually policy that was supportive. And I think a lot of people are interested in it in a different way. And along the way, helped launch Greentown Houston, and now we're doing the Energy Tech Nexus. We'll come back around to what the Energy Tech Nexus is, but I'll let Nada introduce herself.
Yeah, so my name is, again, Nada Ahmed, and I am a founding partner together with Jason of Energy Tech Nexus. And my background's more been in corporate. I graduated with a master's degree from Rice University and started working with carbon capture and storage technology. And this was like around the year 2010, where there was a lot happening within that space. Europe was going to deploy like 10 projects. They had funding for them. And so I was working for a Norwegian company, ended up going to Norway with them and working on CCS globally, worldwide. So my career really started off working in clean technologies. Later on, worked with an EPC in the North Sea, looking at how can we transform as being a provider mostly just for oil and gas projects to doing more offshore wind, CCS, hydrogen. So over the past decade, I've really seen corporates take that transition from being, solely serving oil and gas, but to also looking at how they can diversify their portfolio and take advantage of not only subsidies that are coming up, but also like real business opportunities, and showing to not only their employees but the public that they have a conscience and want to curtail their CO2 footprint. So that's been an interesting journey, but at the same time, I was always really interested in innovation and technology. So even within my corporate roles, I was heading innovation and involved very heavily with the startup community and how to take some of the new technologies and ways of working that they had into corporate. So there was a time kind of around COVID where I decided I wanted to work more closely with startups. So when I moved back here to Houston, I started talking to Jason, and we started our own podcast called the Energy Tech Startups. And around that time, Jason was also exiting Greentown Labs, and we decided that Houston's so big and there's so much going on. There's enough capital, there's enough industry here, that there's space for more ecosystem builders. And that's what we are as Energy Tech Nexus. We're a startup hub for companies working on the energy transition and really want to help cultivate this ecosystem here. And, inspired by what some of the other cities have done, if you look at, Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, and seen how incubators have had a big role to play in cultivating that community. We don't call ourselves an incubator, but you just need that support for startups and also for investors to be able to actually get this technology off the ground and get these projects off the ground.
Yeah, I think it's super underrated that you need kind of an ecosystem player nowadays. Like it's not the same way it probably used to be in Houston, like back in the day when energy was kind of really starting to boom. I'm assuming a lot has changed, and now you probably also have maybe some factions around like renewables versus not. And I know when I first interviewed you, Jason, on the pod, that you talked about the fact that Houston prides itself on being at the forefront of energy generally, right? So I'm really excited to see what you guys are doing here. To tell us a little bit more about what does it look like to be part of Energy Tech Nexus? Like, how do you guys make money? Like, how are you funded, et cetera?
You know that feeling when you meet someone who shares your vision for the future? It just clicks, like two peas in a pod. Well, that's exactly how we felt when we met Goodwin, who we are proud to have as our sponsor.
Being the first major law firm to set up a climate-specific startup and venture practice makes them exactly the kind of partner we are excited to work with. They realize that there are a plethora of challenges to building climate tech startups, and that's why they have built an entire suite of resources for founders, investors, and entrepreneurs in the space. They even offer several tailored pricing methods. And guess what? It doesn't matter where you are listening to this. Goodwin is a global law firm that you can trust to be your partner through it all, from incorporation to exit. They've got you covered.
Go to goodwinlaw.com and tell them Clean Techie sent you to get exclusive access to startup resources. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, happy to jump into that. So as a hub, we're a member-supported organization. We ask members to pay fees. We have, I think, 101 members today who are engaging with us. We actually have about 240 people registered kind of in the ecosystem. And if they can't afford to pay today, we say, great, love to have you in here. Raise money, raise a grant, but we want to be supportive where we can. But there's 100 or so that really support our vision. And the fees are affordable. Our goal is to create authentic connections between founders kind of going through the tough journey of growing a business. And sometimes you just can't spend a lot of money on kind of networking. And so we start membership out at $65 a month today. It's going to go up to $75 once we get around to changing the website. That's like our standing line. But it's about making engagement easy. And one of our policies we have is if a founder comes in and says, look, Jason, I'm short on cash, I'm raising money, we'll do it deferral until they need help or until they can come back and pay back. So we're trying to keep it accessible. We do have a higher rate that's at the 275 level, which allows us to do more one-on-one time and direct mentorship with members. But like with any kind of financial model, you have most of your folks at that entry phase. But that doesn't answer your question on how we make money. So that really just pays for events, that pays for venue. It allows us to provide those direct services. Really, the Tech Nexus today, Energy Tech Nexus today is funded by grants and by engaging with corporate partners. We have a handful of corporate partners that we are going to announce once we hit 10. We are pretty close. So we are building out that partner network today. But that allows us to do two things. One, we get to build those important connections between the strategics who have capital to deploy and startups, and hopefully create business relationships, which we encourage with a lot of our activities. But the other thing we do is give those strategic partners insight into what's coming. And so part of that is providing services where we share all the startups we engage in, all the startups we look at, but then also we bring them together for roundtables, discussions on kind of investment and discussions on the market in a pre-competitive environment. And that really allows us to help those partners kind of see the future and help them identify what their strategy should be so they can deploy capital efficiently. And ultimately, the more capital that we help get deployed, the more we affect our mission.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think, what we often talk about is our vision is the energy trilemma. So it's really solving for security, affordability, and sustainability. And, we've just actually going to publish this week our impact report, and we really talk about there. We lay out, what are our key pillars on which we work on our mission. And we call, our mission is building thunder lizards. That's what we call our companies. They're not unicorns, they're thunder lizards. And they're really going to transform and disrupt the industry in some way. And so one of the things that we do and that we really want to focus on and take advantage of being in Houston, which has a lot of industrial infrastructure. So we focus on innovation infrastructure, we focus on the pilot projects and really giving startups the opportunity to do their first pilots and their second pilots here in Houston. So that's one of the first things that we did last year during our grand opening was do a pilotathon. And that's something that is going to become a yearly event for us. We have a pilot location in the Midlands where we have testing infrastructure, and our startups can go and start testing today their technologies over there. So one of our second pillars is strategic capital access. So that's really about building an investor community, because you're not going to build a startup community without having the capital flow. That's another advantage of Houston, is that you have the capital. We have these big industrials who have the capital. They're people who have made their businesses within not only oil and gas industry, but other, chemicals industries. And how do you unlock that capital? How do you cultivate the investor network? Because we're not used to investing in startups the way you are in some of the other startup cities. Leaderships is really important for us. Like we really, we call ourselves to be founder focused. So that's our third pillar, is how do we make sure that our founders get the support that they need? So we have what we call a founder circle. We have an in-house coach that works with the founders, because as a founder, and Jason knows this, it can be a very lonely journey. And you don't realize a lot of your other startups are going through the same challenges. So we really bring them together to build that community and help them kind of shortcut a lot of the challenges that they're having by talking to each other about it. Then we have the industrial partnership. That's what Jason spoke about, is, some of our founding members. We have these big corporates here who want to pilot, who want to test new technology. And so we build that relationship. The fifth thing that we do is give global access. So not only to companies that are in Houston, but we're also a landing pad for companies from abroad, give them access to Houston. We're doing a project today with Canada where some of the companies might have reached the threshold of their clientele in their region, but then Houston's a natural next step for them to access energy clients. And the last one, and the most important one, is that we want to make sure that the energy transition is also equitable, that we include, more people within it, and especially women. And that's something that's really important to all three of us who are in the partner team. So just to mention Juliana Garay, who was also one of the launch partners of Greentown Labs here in Houston, is also a founding partner. So we make sure that, we not only have this HEDA program, which is the Houston Equitable Energy Transition Alliance, we also have what we call the Determined to Lead network here, where we bring women leaders together and make sure that we share our expertise and make sure that women have a voice in the energy transition.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So, it sounds like you guys are really just like cutting through all of the difficult parts, or some of the most difficult parts, I guess you could say, of building, especially probably a hardware climate startup, getting them access to the corporate partners who want to help with the pilots, which is usually like step number one, right? If you're going to validate things for the big scale, you need to start at a small level. So I really love this focus, and I'm a big fan of community and ecosystem. So, I'm all here for it. But you mentioned something I'd like to touch on a little bit, which is you said that there, aside from just the energy side of things, which is pretty obvious, like Houston is an energy place, you mentioned the chemical space. So do you see, and do you work with a lot of companies trying to innovate in the green chemicals play as well?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think you can decide to kind of define things very thinly or very broadly. And the reality is energy touches so much of our lives. It's really kind of that lever of the Industrial Revolution. And it touches agriculture, it touches advanced materials, because a lot of materials are petrochemicals. Let's be honest, plastics are amazing. And it touches water. Water is one of those things where you look at the cost of doing anything with water and you realize it's really an energy story, because it's all about how much does a kilowatt cost to get accessible water. Same thing with data centers. Like, you look at where data centers are, where crypto is, they put crypto where energy is cheap. And so it's such a tightly coupled economics that we say, look, anything where energy has an outsized impact on that business, we are happy to kind of engage within our business. That's why we talk about carbon capture and storage, right? What does CCUS have to do with energy? It's really an energy sink. Most carbon capture, most storage is highly dependent on the underlying cause of energy. And also, to be honest, it's derivative of an energy product. It's the result of burning fossil fuels. So you can't have one without the other. It's hard to talk about hydrogen without talking about CCUS. And so, to kind of come back to your question, yes, we work with companies working on different types of materials, be it advanced polymers, biopolymers. We're doing a project with a company that does polymer compositions today, and we'll engage with both founders as well as strategics who are looking for that next generation of material. We found historically some of the best kind of innovators or investors in technology were those working on high performance materials. And one of the reasons is it's very clear how to value them. Like, if you have a membrane that has certain performance parameters, you have a plastic that can last at a better temperature range, it's very clear what the market will bear in terms of pricing. You see some of that also in battery technologies. And so in many ways, getting product market fit is less ambiguous when you have these kind of advanced material plays. And so it reduces kind of that market risk when you know what you're supposed to build.
Yeah, because there's a clear objective of what to work towards. Yeah, that's really
Exactly.
interesting. I guess, do you guys have any thoughts on this? One thing I've always hoped that we would see is companies build juggernauts that will at least challenge the incumbents, right? Because it oftentimes feels like in climate, people are building with the intention to be acquired, kind of at the worst case scenario. I mean, obviously that's not the only intention, but it oftentimes feels difficult to say, okay, how are we going to build a new green chemical company, versus just building something really innovative and getting acquired by BASF, right? Like, do you see that being a possibility? Like, will we see new juggernauts created?
Yeah, so our preferred term is thunder lizards. That's what we call them. Yeah, and I think that there's a couple of realities. Like, there's no such thing as a small energy business, and because if you're small, you get acquired, and the only way to get scale is to build something that delivers massive amounts of product. Like, when we're talking about sustainable aviation fuel, you just aren't impactful if you're just building a very small percentage of the market. If you want to have impact, you have to go big, or you have to get acquired. And I think within energy tech, there's a couple of points where you have to decide, make that decision. Do I want to sell the technology and the IP I put together, or do I want to go big? And the reality is the market multiples for going public are far better than the multiples you get for acquisition. Historically, that was probably before 2022 when the IPO market really froze up. But generally, like, if you play the venture capital game, you got to go for what drives the most return to investors, and that typically means hitting public markets. You don't get SaaS company valuations, but it's still better than an acquisition. Personally, if memory serves me correctly, you kind of have to go up to the $1 billion range to even talk about going public. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck in the $40 to $200 million valuation band where you're selling essentially for IP. If you're selling for $40 million, you really haven't had enough money to build a factory or a facility that matters. And so I think that's why you see this goal for going large. The reality is 90% of energy businesses get acquired before as their exit. So I think there's a little bit of reality versus kind of what you need to deliver for your investors. I don't know, Nada, if you have a different perspective.
No, I think you nailed it pretty well.
Very good. Well, I appreciate that perspective. I really hope that we see some new ones, because I hate it. I hate in 100 years for us to have the exact same companies running the world.
Yeah,
let's put it that way.
I think the reality is, like, with any energy revolution, you do have a new technology that comes out, and it's classic disruption. And if they don't get purchased early, they end up dominating. And it's really hard for an energy company, the way they're currently structured, to kind of wrap their heads around the financial structure of these newer businesses. And I think we saw this play out with geothermal. It's so easy to make money making oil. Like you drill your resource, it comes out of the ground, you know it's going to cost $70 a barrel. And by the way, my shale well pays for itself in like 15 months. Like, I get it. You look at a geothermal well, and a lot of times you need to get an offtake that's like 10 years. And an oil company looks at that and says, no, I'd rather drill more shale. Like, it just makes financial sense from a rational perspective for them. And to go off and buy kind of a geothermal asset, it's hard because literally they can't cycle cash the same way they're used to. And so fundamentally, the way they've engineered their business, I think it's very challenging. I think if we see the rise of a geothermal company that kind of gets it and can kind of pull these projects together, they'll just be by themselves. They'll have aggregated all that assets. They'll be the experts. And I wouldn't be surprised if, you got Kinder Morgan here running pipelines. Who's the Kinder Morgan for geothermal, right? There's someone who's coming who's going to be doing that.
Yeah, and I think the energy space is more, we think about the big IOCs, right? You have the Shells and the BPs, and these are like mega companies, and it's hard to think that we're going to be able to disrupt them in the next, decades, I would say. They've been around for more than 100 years. So, and I think going forward in the future, it's not going to be completely disrupting them, and more also looking at like medium-sized companies that are still going to be pretty substantial, going to have a big impact as we diversify the energy mix, to have more geothermal, to have other types of alternative energies, but there's still be a role to play. A good example of a company who's been able to transform successfully is the Danish oil company Ørsted. And just looking at how, we'll see what happens now with the new administration and some of the changes that they've put on offshore drilling. And I know their stock was down 17% since that announcement was made, but they were completely able to transform in a very short period of time. And that's kind of the transformation we're hoping some other companies would make. But we haven't seen it happen because it is very, very hard. And you really have to have that commitment from the top.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's probably the best case scenario, right? Is if people can transition and do like what Ørsted did, that can actually have the most impact on fighting this whole issue. But this is a good segue. So let's talk about the new administration. I guess, broad thoughts. What are you guys thinking about the new? We're just for a record, we're recording this a week after Trump's inauguration. So for people to understand what we're talking about here, maybe there's crazy things that happen between now and when this is published. But for now, we've just got a slew of executive orders basically stating very clearly that oil and gas and drilling is going to be the core thing, and even some crazy things happening with the interconnection side of things. But what are your guys' thoughts on what the next 4 years brings for I guess the clean energy movement in general?
Yeah, Nadia, you had some good thoughts on the drilling activity this morning.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, depending on when your listeners listen to this, but I think we kind of know the direction the new administration is going to take. So we know they have put a pause on the IRA, the infrastructure bill. It's pending a 90-day review, and there's a lot of questions because the government will face a lot of legal challenges on if they can actually take the funding away, especially for projects that have been promised funding. So there's a big uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. But this uncertainty is not good for projects, especially clean energy projects, who already are challenged when it comes to, getting investors on board, getting infrastructure funding, because they're often first of a kind type of projects. So, I mean, overall, we know the news is not good, but then there's certain areas that the government is prioritizing, like geothermal, for example, like hydro. So there's a lot of focus on base load, which includes obviously natural gas and coal, but it also includes hydro, geothermal, nuclear. And I know there's a lot of, pro-climate people who've been talking about nuclear and how we've been really ignoring that. So this would be the time for us to start seeing if we can actually make progress on nuclear. I mean, 4 years is still a very short period of time for us to even build a nuclear power plant. But one of the other things that he's also done is, accelerate some of the permitting and approvals for these projects. So we might see some of these projects come in faster. In terms of drilling, I think what we were talking about earlier, Jason, is that it's really, just because the government comes in and says, drill more, doesn't mean oil and gas companies are going to drill more, because it's really going to be driven by market. If they see it as profitable. And it really depends on the price of oil per barrel. I think last time I checked, the price of oil is right now around like $76 a barrel, which is like okay. But if we suddenly get a lot of oil in the market, the price could fall. And if it falls around $66, there's not a lot of incentive for people to produce more.
That's what I was going to ask, is because my understanding of, I don't have a deep understanding of the oil and gas business, but it's usually they're very agile based on the price of oil, which goes to my underlying question with this whole thing. Is like Trump is supposedly saying, hey, we're going to try to lower energy costs for consumers. But if your energy market is completely based on the price of oil and gas, you're going to have these boom and busts with the price, right? With, fuel prices going through the roof. And I just wonder, like, how can he actually achieve this? I don't even, maybe I'm misspeaking, but I thought he said something about like having the cost of the average person's like energy. And I don't know how you see how you do that unless you have a really stable kind of type of energy source like renewables could provide.
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge with understanding oil is that there's been a shift in kind of the dynamics of the price of oil. And it used to be that OPEC really had a strong control of kind of oil supply. And that was when the U.S. was a net importer of energy. And guess what? We had the shale revolution, which changed entirely how we pulled oil out of the ground. And now the U.S. is a net exporter of gas. We're a net exporter of oil. And why are we exporting it? Because other people pay more for it than we will, right? I mean, that's as simple as that. And then yes, there's a transport cost. It probably costs, $5 a barrel to get it down to the port, and then you got to process and you got to ship it. Maybe that's $5 to $10 to get to another location. But that kind of tells you that there's an oversupply because we're sending it elsewhere. If we really wanted to, oh my gosh, it would be so painful. If we really wanted to reduce the cost of oil, we would shut down exports. That's not going to happen. But I think ultimately the shale dynamic has shifted the power of who sets price. It's no longer OPEC, which is effectively a market cartel. It's individual companies looking at the forecast and saying, okay, we can turn these oil wells on as quickly as next month and start getting them produced. And they have a very rigorous prediction of how many drilling rigs they want to have, what leases they're going to produce, and they index the amount of drilling based on supply. And I think we learned this in the supply, like there was a lot of supply variation in the 2016 and 2018 cycles because we were just learning how much shale can swing the market. And then it's kind of stabilized because I think a lot of the smart people who do financial planning looked at this and said, we don't want to overbuild because it'll hurt us in the long run. And they kind of turn on the drilling programs as they need it. They kind of have a plan for the year, but it really gets locked in with that kind of financial discipline that Houston is known for. What you'll see, though, is because there's not a long-term demand for stable oil prices or a long-term expectation of stable oil prices, you haven't seen offshore drilling pick up. So offshore drilling is where you get these mega billion-dollar kind of build-outs where there's a lot of, it's expensive, number one. That's part of the reason you don't want to do it. You don't want to make $1 billion bet and then see the price of oil drop. There's a much higher preference for these small, I think fracking and drilling a small well now is still under $10 million. So much easier to kind of modulate on supply when there's that kind of ability to kind of control your price and have good certainty. And so what are we going back to? Like it's hard to kind of force the supply to change, especially when the free market, the people making these decisions know when to pull back on their own drilling to kind of maintain a healthy income for the company and for their shareholders, to be honest. That's kind of their mandate. And we don't have a national oil company here in the U.S. to force it. So that's one of the beauties of the kind of open market we have in the U.S.
Yeah. And then if you look at, you talked about the price of gas for individual consumers, right? Price of gas right now is not expensive. It's, I think, $3 a gallon, and it's been like that for the past decade. And adjusted for inflation, it hasn't really increased much. So, I don't know incrementally how much producing more oil is going to decrease the cost per gallon to the consumer. But, I think some people have also written about there's a lot of also new regulation that's going to expand LNG export terminals. And that's going to drive demand and then potentially, also drive up costs. So there's some confusing levers out there. We don't know exactly what's going to happen because there's, drill more, but then also export more LNG, and how that is actually going to play out in terms of price, we don't really know.
One thing I'd be curious if either of you know much about is, I could be completely misinformed by this, but I understand that when the U.S. does fracking, it's possible to do it in a very clean way compared to what a lot of other countries do. Is that something you guys have much knowledge on, whether or not they're capturing
Oh,
kind of the carbon or the methane that comes from that? I'm not super well
yeah.
educated.
So I think if you think about where there are resource-rich countries that have a lot of oil and they haven't actually started fracking, you realize that Europe has banned fracking, so there's not going to be any of that there. That's a high regulation environment, but they also just said not on our turf. The U.S. by comparison to other countries is has a lot of regulation. And so I think there are, we got to clean the water. We only have so much flaring we're allowed to do. I think there are parts of the world where they don't care if you flare. Like maybe they want to, but it's just not a cost that the country can support. And you got to remember the reason we flare is it's safety. You burn off these explosive gases that could have a safety issue. But second, methane is 34 times more impactful from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective than CO2. And so we flare the gas, we do something called VOC reduction, where you kind of remove these other heavy hydrocarbons, which are also impactful. And a lot of states like North Dakota and the Bakken is very strict on how much emissions you have to reduce down because they want to make sure you don't flare too much. I would say Texas is its own animal, so I won't get into that in too much. But in general, the U.S. is a high regulatory environment, and I think there's